Welcome everybody to the Efficiency for Access Design Challenge webinar series. Today's webinar is focused on sustainability and how contributing towards the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. We have a special speaker today from Sustainable Development Solutions Network, SDSN, Dr. Kate Roll, whom we'll introduce in a moment. I am Jackie Garcia, Senior Project Manager for the Efficiency for Access Design Challenge, and I'm joined by my colleague Sean, who you may know from previous webinars. He will be managing today the chat room, so if you have questions during the webinar and you prefer not to send to the whole room, feel free to send it directly to him. We are excited to have you all here, both live and through the recording. But just before we start, just some housekeeping information. This webinar and its transcript is being recorded, and it will be available online on the Efficiency for Access Design Challenge website and on the general workspace of the Crowdsolve page, as all of the other webinars that are part of this series of webinars. If you don't want to be recorded, please turn off your video and mute yourself. You can also change the name and display, clicking on the three dots on the top right-hand side of the corner of your picture, or through the attendee list, right-clicking on the More option next to your name. We will share the recording and slides with you following the events on Crowdsolve. And during the presentation, please mute yourself to avoid any distractions and background noise, so it will be easier to hear our speaker. But feel free to turn your mic and micro back on during the Q&A section at the end of the webinar for some live questions. And feel free to use the hand raising function during this portion of the event, that it can be found at the bottom of the screen. We will then call upon you. Additionally, the chat will be open to questions and comments from our audience throughout the event. And if you have any questions after the webinar, or after you've watched the recording, or you would just like to pick up the conversation back up again, or share some resources you found interesting, feel free to do so on the Crowdsolve post for this webinar in the comment section. Remember, this year, webinars are organized around the different elements of the assessment criteria, and you will have to address this same topic in your own design process. So I encourage everybody to ask questions of our panelists while you have her attention. Today, we are looking at one of the sustainability criteria and the linkages between your designs and the SDGs. We are especially looking at the question highlighted here, found in your challenge brief. Oops, I'm sorry. How does your design contribute to the Sustainable Development Goals, in particular SDG 7, affordable and clean energy? How well have you demonstrated you understood the potential connections with the other SDGs and its associated targets, and consider how the different areas in this assessment framework are contributing to this? The webinar agenda for the next hour or 55 minutes will include a presentation from our special speaker, followed by a Q&A section. And we will have some small breakout rooms to discuss in smaller groups. So our speaker today, it's Dr. Kate Roll. She has an impressive curriculum, and I would like her to introduce herself. Over to you, Kate.
Thank you so much, Jackie, and thank you so much to everyone who's joined. It would be great in the chat to add, put where you're from, where you're joining us from today, and maybe a little bit about yourself, because we've got a small enough group that we can have a little bit of interaction. So my name's Kate Roll. I'm an assistant professor at University College London at the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, and I also lead up the Sustainable Development Solutions Network UK, which is a university-wide network based in the UK, but there's also regional and national networks all over the world. So it's quite possible that wherever you are also has an SDSN network and has a student student hub. So, take a look at that. I'm a political scientist by training, and my work has been eclectic. So I've worked on everything from post-conflict transitions to private sector approaches to poverty reduction. And then a lot of my current work has been around the SDGs, including a big project that I just finished in Spain, thinking about the connection between the Sustainable Development Goals and tax. So I'll probably go ahead and share my screen. So if you unshare, Jackie. Okay, great. Wonderful to see people coming in. Great. And, if you have the bandwidth, it would be great if you have your camera on when I don't have slides up. And when I have slides up on the screen, then it's fine to turn your camera off. That's how I do it when I teach. Great. So I'll go into my slides so everyone can relax, and then we'll do a couple exercises just to get rolling. Okay. So, I'm going to give a bit of an overview of the SDGs, what they are, what they're about. My experience has been that we talk about the SDGs all the time. We see them everywhere, or you see them often. You see people with their lapel pins, or they're in the first bit of a journal article, but very rarely do people sort of dig into them a little bit more and particularly think about the politics of them. And so I'm a political scientist, so I'm very interested in those kind of dynamics. So I'll talk a little bit about what the SDGs are, where they came from, right? These have a history to them, what they look like in practice. And then I'm going to talk through sort of four main questions that come up, some which should be highly relevant to your work. I'm also going to give us a sort of a moment to reflect on SDG 7, which is most closely tied to the work around energy that I think all of you are doing. But before we go into that, I want to do an exercise using Mentimeter. So if you go to menti.com, and then you enter that code, I'll put both of these in the chat, then you should be able to enter some information about yourself. I'll collect a little bit of a social graph. So I'll stop sharing and I'll put this into the chat. So I'll put also a direct link into the chat, which makes it a little bit easier. So if you go there, you should be able to answer a few questions about yourself. Great. So I'm seeing a couple people have put theirs in. That's great. So if you use, Nora, if you use the code, the link that I've just put in the chat, you should be able to join, to do the So I'm seeing one engineer and one other, and the information in the code is there. Let's see if we can get maybe two others to go. And maybe put in the chat what you are if you're not one of these areas of study. Data science, industrial design, excellent. Okay, very nice. So when you're ready, we can go to the next slide. So we've got 5 participants, that's good. Let's go to this question. How familiar are you with the SDGs? And this should be a linked response. Is this something you work with a lot? Somewhat familiar? So this is pretty normal, that no one feels like they're a complete expert in this area. And maybe we'll just go to the last one, which is a brainstorming, where we'll do words that you associate with the SDGs. Here we use create a word cloud. So it should ask you to enter a few words that you associate with the SDGs. And thank you, Jackie, for putting in the code there as well. Let's just get a couple people putting in words that they associate with the SDGs. Okay, that's fine. If that's, we can go on with the slides. That can often be a nice exercise to see where sort of what people's thoughts are about the SDGs, what their sort of understandings are of the SDGs. But good to see the group, good to see where you guys are coming from and what type of experience. I'm used to talking with people who are mainly political scientists or designers or public policy people. So it's always good to have a different perspective. Great, so we'll get moving with the talk. So the Sustainable Development Goals, this is the sort of image that most people are familiar with. We've got the 17 goals, then we zoom out, we've got 169 targets, so a lot of targets, and then even more indicators, over 230 indicators. And these were adopted by the UN member states in 2015. It's also sometimes called the 2030 Agenda because they're supposed to be achieved by 2030. And it's aimed at forming a comprehensive and consensus view of the future. And this is a slide for your reference, not one that I would expect you to be able to read here. The point in the history that's captured in this slide is that there's been a long process leading to this. So this agenda was adopted in 2015, but it really was first conceptualized in 1992 with the Rio Earth Summit. And if you think about the work that led into the Rio Earth Summit, so these kind of goals, they have this long history. They've got this, multiple steps that it took to get us here. And so, these didn't come from nowhere. These have a history. They've got key participants, key voices. And the precursor to the SDGs were the Millennium Development Goals, which some of you may be familiar with if you're sort of my age. And so those were adopted in 2000, and there were just 8 of them, right? Not 17. And they were considered to be simple, measurable, consensus-based. But they're quite different from the SDGs in the sense that they're focused on a North-South aid agenda. They only applied to developing countries, post-industrial or industrialized nations. These weren't for them, which is different again to the SDGs, where all UN member states are signed up. And there's a sort of a geopolitical or political economy critique saying these were part of sort of a post-Cold War world order of a rationale for aid in the post-Cold War geopolitics. And despite sort of the breakthrough nature of the Millennium Development Goals, there was a lot of concern that these had a very basic needs view of poverty. So a view that focuses on the individual and maybe things like how many calories someone needs to eat rather than a social or systemic or embedded view. There was not much interest in systems or inequality, not much interest in institutions. So there was a lot missing. The parsimony of aid led to some missing pieces. And it was considered to be sort of a technocratic approach. So coming from very high up with the UN Secretary General and not so much consultation. And so, for all the positives of the MDGs, they were in for a lot of critiques. And so, 15 years after the MDGs, we're looking at the SDGs, and we're already talking or starting to have conversations about what comes after the SDGs. But the SDGs widened the scope, right? So we've got more goals, it's a more systemic view. it had a much more bottom-up view. So environment ministers from Latin America were really key actors in getting the SDGs set up. So a very different origin story than coming from sort of the closed office of the Secretary General. So a different story here. And sort of in some ways some positive, and also critically important, widen to all nations. So again, this is a little bit of a timeline of the consultative process, where it was moving between an open working group and then the high level political forum. So you're having many more people around the table. But there's still been some critics. You know, when this first came out, we think two sort of bastions of public opinion, the Foreign Policy magazine and The Economist, both sort of made fun of the SDGs, senseless, dreamy, and garbled, stupid development goals. So, you know, this hasn't, you know, everyone sort of is signed up to them now, but, you know, they were controversial at the time and were more widely critiqued. So we're going to go into sort of SDGs in practice, giving that just being sort of a little bit of the origin story of the SDGs. So again, here we are, 17 goals, 169 targets, 232 indicators. And if you haven't done this, I really encourage you to go to this URL, which we can put into the chat, and actually just download the Excel table of the SDGs. You know, it's highly accessible, it's searchable, it's really easy to use. And so anyone can just pull down the SDGs and be able to look and sort and manipulate some of that framework. So, you know, it's out there and easy to get through UN stats. And that's where we start to see, so we've got gender equity being SDG 5, and then we start to see, okay, what are the targets? Well, here we've got highlighted enhanced use of enabling technologies, particularly ICTs, to promote female empowerment. So you see, okay, that's the target. And then you dig a little bit deeper and they've got an associated indicator. And so they're looking at a breakdown of proportion of individuals who own mobile phones by sex, right? So you can sort of lift under the hood, lift under the bonnet and see what's going on. And this should be familiar to any of you guys who have done M&E work. It's a mix of different types of indicators. So we're measuring inputs, so like the number of doctors per capita, outputs, the number of people trained, outcomes, what percentage of people have a certain disease or what percentage of people have a certain access to treatment, and impacts. So, you know, it's a bit of a jumble in there, which can also affect how we interact with the SDGs. And what I want to do is, because all of you, have been working on energy issues, is to take a moment in breakout rooms. I'm going to see if this works, to just reflect on goal 7, and we can put this this into the chat. I'd love if you go in your browser to the link there. We'll put it into the chat, and then on the second tab, it just has a list of the targets and indicators for SDG 7. And I want in your small groups to consider the questions. What surprises you about this? What's missing? There's a lot of things there, but from your perspective, what do you think are missing in terms of the targets or indicators? And what are the strengths or weaknesses of how these are being conceptualized? So I'm going to stop sharing and put this into the chat. Any questions about what I've just asked you all to do? Okay. So I'll put everyone into breakout rooms, and we'll just go in for 3 or 4 minutes. Yeah, I've just put the link in. And I'll pause the recording. So everyone should be going into their rooms. Welcome back, everyone. So I'm always a little bit wary of breakout rooms when I don't know how good people's connections are and if people are connecting on phones. But I would love to hear what you talked about, if you had any reflections on SDG 7, what you saw or what you discussed in your groups. Even if you just introduced each other in your groups, that's also fine. I'd love to see 1 or 2 hands up.
We just introduced each other and what we do, our backgrounds, and we didn't have time to discuss any further.
Great. Did the breakout room work okay? Were you able to connect okay?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Would it be worth going back into the groups and having more time?
Sure.
Okay, let's if it seemed like the groups were working okay, let's spend a little bit more time and come up with 1 strength and 1 weakness that you see in terms of the way SDG 7 is working, and be able to report back. So let's try 1 more time, because I think this is good for people to actually dig into the targets and indicators. Okay, we'll go back into breakout rooms. And I'm going to make 2 larger rooms, because I think then that gives us a little bit more flex if people can't join. Great, welcome back, everyone. So you've had sort of 2 quick breakouts with your group, and I would love to hear what you discussed, particularly if you came up with any observations or strengths and weaknesses looking at SDG 7 and how it's constructed. Is there someone who would want to represent one of the groups? We had 2 groups. Yeah, Jyoti, please come in.
Yeah, so in our group, me and Jian, we had a great discussion regarding what are the advantages and disadvantages. So the advantages of SDG 7 is it aims to have clean and affordable energy for all. So that's the advantages. The advantages is it is sustainable, and it aims to make it affordable. The affordability part is great here, but at the same time, when we discuss the disadvantages part, so what we discussed is for SDG 7, it will be a huge economical burden for countries to provide clean and affordable energy for all, because currently wherever people do not have access to electricity or energy, it is due to a lack of infrastructure and finance, and to some extent political will. So SDG have that disadvantage, that it requires a lot of finance.
Yeah, that's a really nice point. And if you go in, 7.8.1, they actually try to capture some of that by saying, what are the international financial flows to support this energy transition? But you're absolutely right that, you can trace the percentage of folks that have access to clean and affordable energy. But, where are you creating that shift? How are you making sure that happens? Yeah, really nice observation. Simeng, did you want to add to anything that Jyoti mentioned?
That's right. I agree with what Jyoti has said. It might take a lot of effort or a lot of finance to build the infrastructure, but once it's built, or we are going to find a way to get easy access of the effort of the infrastructure, it will achieve the goals, just as the 7th goal at the state, which can be accessible both on human beings and also for the environment, which means maybe we can achieve a second system which is less harmful to the environment by a small amount of financial issues. by the kind of these issues. Yeah.
Yeah, really nicely put. Yeah, well done, both of you guys. Anyone else want to contribute from the other group? Did you guys talk about the financial aspect or other aspects of the SDG? Okay, if not, that's totally fine. I'm going to move forward. But this is just a reminder, when you've got some time, go into that link, go into that second tab where it goes through the targets and indicators, and really take a close look at, what's being tracked, what's being prioritized in the SDG. And in your own position as someone who's learning a lot about this, studying this, is building expertise, what's your own critical reflection on how it's being operationalized? Okay. Good. So, and this sort of goes to, when we talk about the strengths and weaknesses, we do need to think about, these are incredibly powerful. We're asking nations to report against them. We're asking big corporations in some cases to report against these indicators or a modified form of them. So, we really need to be careful about that. And this is a nice sort of critique by a scholar called Fukuru Par, who says, goals can lead to distorting effects. You start to orient your action towards the goal, not necessarily towards, maybe the bigger picture. So, we need to be very, very careful about, how we set up our indicators, particularly. Because, like that example with women and mobile phones, if we're talking about, well, empowerment through technology, is that the same thing as having a woman access a mobile phone? I actually think there's some slippage there between the goal to the target to the indicator. And I'll talk about that in a bit. So we have these quantitative indicators. We have, a few different characteristics that we see across the set. So I want to, close the talk by raising sort of four key questions, that I think everyone should be thinking about when they think about the SDGs, and I think are too often left out. So the first question is, are SDGs neutral? The second is about how do they interact? And this is, I think Ziyang already mentioned this a little bit. We're talking about energy and environment, and they comment about financing and institutions, and we're already seeing points about interaction. How do they drive change? And then what about context? Does this mean the same thing in different places? Is it possible to have a single set of goals, or possible to have a single set of indicators that are meaningful, both in the UK and in Nigeria, right? Where I understand many of you guys are joining us from. So the first is, we like to pretend the SDGs are neutral or technical, but they're the product of a political process. And, there are issues that attract a lot of attention. There's ones that are considered orphaned, that aren't so interesting, that people don't, want to spend time on. And so those get left out. There's things that are extremely hard to measure. So one thing that we see is not in the SDGs are things around language and culture. And I think part of that is these can be very, very hard to quantify. There's tension between statisticians and diplomats. And then there's always questions about, who has the final say. So, the SDGs are both highly comprehensive, but also have some blind spots. So you can see I've pulled headlines about debates over whether LGBTQI or gay and lesbian rights should be included in the SDGs. That was a negotiated, contested part of them, just like language and culture are also a contested part that then ended up not being in. So we have to remember these are political, these are a product of a political process and negotiation. And their expression is also political, in the sense that, firms and countries, say, oh, we're committing to all 17 goals. But if you actually look where energy and investment is going, energy in terms of political will, another good point raised by participants, is that it's not evenly distributed. So, much more attention will go to poverty, for example, then we'll go to institution building. More energy more focus will go to gender. Then we'll go to energy. We've got these sort of disproportionate. So you can see that in this ranking table, the green ones are where we see the most investment. This is looking at corporate numbers, and then the ones at the bottom, so decent work, peace, life on land, life below water, those are all further down. The second point is we need to be thinking about SDGs as interacting. We need to be thinking about bundles of policies, bundles of interventions, and they can have both reinforcing interactions, and they can have countering interactions or negative interactions. So this example in this paper by Fader that I've quoted here is saying, well, we can look at water and land. These are incredibly important, but are these in conflict with high yield agriculture? How do we balance these, or how do we figure out how to manage conflicts? Because at a certain point, increasing energy, if it's not, clean energy, or even if it is clean energy, and we're talking about transitions where we're taking a lot of cars off the roads, that's creating different forms of waste that can have negative impacts. So we can't think of these in isolation. We've got to think of them as interacting. And so, this is some work done around clean water, zero hunger, and energy. And saying that, if you see any of these sort of pink ones, that's where there's this view that the relationship is constraining, where one going up can constrain the ability of the other to go up. But also equally, you can see that most of this table is what they call supporting or reinforcing, whereas they actually move in concert. Improving clean energy can be a great way to improve clean air, right? We're seeing fewer particulates, we're seeing less CO2 emissions. You can see those as moving together. But this really needs to be, central and in focus. And my sense is whatever comes after the SDGs is going to have a lot more focus on interaction and a lot more focus on bundles and linkages rather than individual targets and indicators. The third point of 4 is this question of how do SDGs drive change? This is a question that I get a lot from particularly undergrads, where they say, this isn't the law. The UN can't make law. They can't enforce this. What's the point? How does this affect anything, right? And there's a part of me that says that's an absolutely, that's a perfectly valid critique of the SDGs. And it is one of the weaknesses. But then we also think to say, okay, well, we don't have hard international law on this. We've got what we call soft international law. How is that still impactful with limitations? And so we have to think about the audience. So who are the SDGs for? We think a lot about how they are used by advocacy organizations, and then use them to have a dialogue with policymakers. They're used by funders and aid agencies. There's been a lot of work trying to harmonize reporting requirements. They're used in corporate reporting increasingly. They're using in investment. We've seen this growth in ESG investment, and the SDGs, are linked into that work. So there's a few core audiences, and then of course pathways through those. And so we see elements of peer pressure that come through reporting. We see civil society mobilization. If you guys have done a bit of political science, you might be familiar with the idea of agenda setting. What is on the list? What are we going to discuss? What is important to say we're committed to? And then those kind of commitments can help create political will and help create political change. So what is considered to be appropriate? What's the norm? And then there's also sort of methodological changes where we're saying that these indicators are important. So organizations need to start shifting their practices, need to start shifting their policy design to meet and promote these indicators. So that's also quite important area. So, again, the SDGs have a lot of open source data behind them. The UK does a report, lots of nations not only do their own report, but places like Bangladesh and Vietnam have set up their own indicators. They've localized their indicators. So there's a lot of information out there, and that's a very useful tool for advocates. So you can see how there can be, you know, Spain and Portugal. You could say, well, look over the border, you know, they're doing better than us. We need to catch up. You can see how some of those discourses can be harnessed. And then this idea of normative change, like I mentioned, you know, what is considered to be the right type of policy, the right type of speech, you know, and you're seeing this, certain places and certain countries have really adopted language around the SDGs and others have avoided it. But there's sort of a window of opportunity to connect policies and the sustainable development agenda. And I'd mentioned in that earlier slide, this sort of methodological change. What do we measure? What do we care about? What are we looking for? And this can be critiqued in sort of, you know, this governance by numbers, again, quoting from Foucault-Dupart, but it also says that, well, we're looking, you know, we're looking for these certain things, and they're helping to, again, set priorities. You can also see how SDGs can start to play into policy processes. This is a really classic policy cycle where you're starting with problem identification, and then moving towards policy formation. What is the policy? You're saying why it's the right policy, you're implementing it, then you're evaluating it, and then you're shifting. And so you can see that, you know, the SDGs can come in to a lot of different points in terms of both giving targets that we're using for our measurement, for our policy evaluation, but also in that policy legitimization. Why do we need to do clean energy? Why do we need to work on this green transition? Well, we've made commitments to the SDGs. The SDGs are an important global agenda, right? You can see the rhetoric that's tied to that policy legitimization, which, you know, again, tied to political will. And this is just a minor point. You know, you can also argue that the SDGs come embedded with what we call a theory of change. So a viewpoint on what matters and how things work. So the example that I already mentioned about women and cell phones, you know, there's sort of an idea that more cell phones for women means, you know, more, you know, access to technology, and that has some gender equity benefits. And I think we can engage with those critically. That may be the case, but it may not necessarily be the case. And then finally, and this should, I think, be interesting to all of you, because it looks like you're coming from lots of different places, is context is so important. So the same goals and targets and indicators that we're using in Spain, we're also using in Kenya, right? And so there's a question of what interests are intersecting and then what aren't. You know, when I was working in Spain, they're not really concerned about youth so much. They're really concerned about an aging population. Whereas other places that have a much different demographic makeup, ideas of a youth bulge, of young people, is really, really pressing. So, you know, there's areas where, you know, the issues are just really different. You know, are you worried about malnutrition and malnourishment, or are you worried about obesity, right? So we're both those fit under health, but they're sort of really different. And so this one size fits all becomes a real challenge. So, you know, then you say, well, let's make some variation, let's shift, let's create our own indicators, which sounds great. You localize, right? It's called localization. But then suddenly you've got, you know, 192 different indicator sets, and some of this coherence by having one set of SDGs for everyone starts to break down. So this is one of the, again, just like the interaction is a core tension, this type of contextualization, localization is another core issue. This is an example from South Africa, where they're working to align their national development program with the SDGs. So you're seeing a lot of sort of local political action that's either adjusting frameworks or connecting them to existing frameworks. So again, these are sort of four key beats, four key considerations that I think, you know, get left out in some discussions of the SDGs. You know, are they neutral? How do they interact? How do they drive change? What's the mechanism if we don't have that hard international law or hard law behind them? And what about context? So I'm gonna conclude there, really. You know, the SDGs are political, they have a history, they're contested and imperfect, right? There's lots of bargaining, lots of negotiation that went into them. And they have ideas embedded in them about what is sort of the good way forward, right? And in that way can also be contested. So those are sort of some issues that I think are always important to keep in mind, along with sort of the importance of this framework for aligning action and raising awareness and creating sort of political space for certain key changes. So I'll stop sharing there, and I've used more time than I expected, but I'm happy to take questions for the rest of the time that we have. I understand you're incorporating SDGs into some of the projects you're doing, and I'd be also just curious to hear how you're doing that.
You can write the questions on the chat or raise your hands or unmute yourselves.
And if there's no questions, that's absolutely fine. I think, you know, my main recommendation to all of you guys working on the SDGs is to actually go into the framework. Very easily accessible online through UN Stats. Easy to find data from your country or countries that you're interested in. And, you know, rather than staying on this really generalized view of the SDGs, to open it up and look critically at the composition and see how your work fits with it, or actually maybe addresses parts that aren't part of the SDGs, which I think is equally important to understand and recognize. So, you know, dig in, really look at at not only the 17 goals, but also the 169 targets and the 232 indicators. Yeah.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you for the nice presentation. Can I ask you a question?
Of course, please.
Yeah, when designing, like when you're designing a product, you talk about when we are considering about the political issues, like when you are designing for, especially when you are designing a product for the area or the country that you are not familiar with. So can you give us or give me some kind of recommendations or methodologies when it comes into the ethnical problems when doing a design or something? Yeah.
So challenges in designing for context that you're not familiar with, is that right?
Exactly.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think what we're increasingly seeing as best practice is that you try to avoid that situation, in the sense that you want to partner with someone who really understands the context or the issue. You know, some of this we talk about, you know, pro-poor innovation or para-poor innovation, particularly if we're talking about low-income folks. And you might involve people in product design and testing who actually would be using the product. You know, it's not always possible, but that's sort of always the aspiration. And there's, you know, just many stories of products being designed without having the participation of people and then not being effective in the field. I used to teach the one laptop per child case, which was sort of an ed tech invention of a very robust laptop, which was supposed to be $100 per laptop. This is coming out of MIT. And they'd spent a lot of time on the product design. And I think it probably was still pretty good. But what they hadn't considered was the whole, what we call the social envelope around technology. So teachers really hated this, and they hadn't gotten the teachers involved. So, you know, the Department of Education, they were buying all these laptops, but the teachers didn't see how they fit in the classroom. They resisted it. And so the technology never was used as envisioned. So it's both thinking about the users, thinking about the various stakeholder groups, thinking about the systems in which these interact. You know, there's lots of stories of stoves being invented that aren't the right sort of, you know, shape or heating elements for local cuisines. So that's where all of this involving people who are the end users becomes incredibly important. If you can't do that, you know, Skype interviews, lots of research, find people in your network who know about the users, and you know, and also all these design principles of iterate, you know, learn fast and change as you go, I think are often the advice. But yeah, hope that's helpful.
I see. That sounds very reasonable. Yeah, it reminds me of one example. Like when you are going to fetch some water. During research, like when you're going to fetch some water, the people in Uganda, they maybe fetch the water with a barrel and put it up all the way up their head. But somewhere in China, we may be using 2 barrels and using a shoulder bowl like that. As you can see, it's the same appliances and the same using for the product. It's for fetching water, but in different areas, it might be differently useful and different customizations. So
Yeah.
it's always good to consider about this. But you know, doing a research is a little bit hard, especially in COVID times.
Yeah, definitely. And that's always going to be the constraint. And, you know, we see that with academic research along with sort of product design and sort of some of this innovation initiatives. Yeah. But I think understanding it's both, you know, the technological context. So, you know, where's the water table, you know, what kind of wells are appropriate? Is there arsenic in the groundwater? So we need to be doing it. You know, there's all of those sort of technical specs, but there's also, again, that social envelope of, you know, what's the function, you know, who's doing the water collecting? What do they like about it? What, you know, why does the system work that way? Because I think oftentimes people just say, oh, that looks really inefficient, or that looks like it's badly designed. But actually, you know, we see these practices, you know, becoming over many, many decades. There's a reason behind them. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a wonderful answer. Yeah, I will try to search for the network I'm familiar with and search for the people who really knows about the area which I want to dig into. Yeah, thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you. Great. So, you know, we've basically come to the hour. So, you know, thank you all for your attention and for joining. It's been really nice to spend some time with you. I'll be sharing the slides with Jackie, so she'll be able to send those around, and Jackie and Sean. And I think the recording will also be available. So I hope that's useful, and please get in touch if you've got more questions around the SDGs, and check out SDSN. You know, the UK, if you're based in the UK, check out our network, but they're all over, and they've also got youth networks that are globally active. So that might be an interesting place, particularly if you're doing work in this space and you're really working on solutions. They have a nice platform for connecting. Yeah.
Thank you, Kate. It was a really, really interesting and inspiring presentation. Thank you, Kate, and thank you to all the attendees. I'm sure this session has given you all a lot of food for thought and triggered some ideas on how you can incorporate what Kate has been sharing with you all today into your project designs and beyond that also. So thank you.
Great.
Now for closing, the recording of this webinar will be available, as I mentioned at the beginning, on the Efficiency for Access Design Challenge website, in case you want to revisit some of the examples and interesting information you've listened here today. We also value your feedback, and we would like to hear your opinion. So let me share my screen so you can go to scan this QR code, and you can go to the feedback survey. It will take less than 1 minute to respond, and that will help us to improve for the next one. I'll share the link also in the chat in a moment. Here, in case you cannot access through the QR code. Okay. Also, if you haven't signed up to our challenge newsletter, you can do it through this next link here, and you will receive the newsletter every 2 months with some information about the challenge and some of the updates from the sector, etc. I'll share also here on the chat. And if you have any questions or comments, please send us an email to e4achallenge@est.org.uk. The email is in the chat also. And yeah, thank you very much. Thank you to all. And see you on our next event, that it's the second career conversation session that we will focus on startups and will take place on the 17th of March. Thank you very much. Have a lovely day.
Take care. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.